Picture this. You're 34,000 years ago, somewhere in the Zagros Mountains of what is now northern Iraq. Your right arm ends just below the elbow. Your left eye sees nothing. One ear has been deaf for years. To survive here, in a world with no agriculture, no stored grain, no fallback plan, you are supposed to hunt. You cannot throw a spear. You cannot track game across broken terrain for 6 hours. By every reasonable calculation, you should already be dead. And yet you're not. Here's the disruption. In 1957, an American archaeologist named Ralph Solecki excavated a cave called Shanidar in Iraqi Kurdistan and found the skeleton of a Neanderthal man who fit exactly that description. One arm gone, one eye blind, partial deafness, arthritis creeping through his joints. Researchers estimate he lived into his 40s. In a hunting and gathering world, that's not a body that should have lasted another decade. It lasted for years, maybe decades, after his injuries. This is going to change how you think about who actually got to survive in the ancient world. And it isn't the strongest hunters. It's the ones other people decided were worth keeping alive. Start with that man, now known as Shanidar I. Solecki's team pulled his remains from a layer of sediment dated to roughly 45,000 years ago. The skeleton told a story piece by piece. The right forearm had been amputated or crushed so early in his life that the bone had fully healed and remodeled around the injury, meaning he survived the initial trauma by a wide margin, then kept living for years afterward. His skull showed damage consistent with blindness in one eye. Bone growth in his ear canal suggests significant hearing loss. Degenerative joint disease had spread through his hips and legs, the kind you'd expect in someone decades older. None of this killed him quickly. Something, or someone, kept him alive long enough for arthritis to set in. Think about the math of a Paleolithic band. Groups were small. Anthropologists estimate typical Neanderthal bands at somewhere between 10 and 30 individuals. Every one of those individuals ate from the same limited pool of meat, fat, and foraged plants. A one-armed, half-blind man contributes almost nothing to that pool. He can't run down an ibex. He can't butcher efficiently with one hand. In pure caloric terms, he's a drain on the group for years. Solecki's discovery, published through the early 1960s, became one of the first hard pieces of evidence that Neanderthals weren't the brutish, every man for himself creatures they'd been imagined as since the first Neanderthal bones were identified in Germany's Neander Valley back in 1856. Something else was happening at Shanidar. Someone was feeding this man. Someone was probably helping him move. For years. But here's where it gets stranger. Shanidar I wasn't an isolated case. Move forward roughly 35,000 years and about 5,000 kilometers west to a limestone cave on the Calabrian coast of southern Italy called Grotta del Romito. In the 1960s, Italian researchers excavating the site uncovered the skeleton of a young man now catalogued as Romito II. His bones showed achromosomalic dysplasia, a rare form of dwarfism that shortens the forearms and lower legs severely while leaving the torso closer to normal length. Standing, he would have reached perhaps 130 centimeters, well under 4.5 feet. He died around age 17. That itself is notable. Severe dwarfism of this type usually comes with serious health complications that kill much earlier without intervention. Getting a body like his to adolescence in a community that depended on chasing red deer and ibex across mountain terrain for food is not something that happens by accident. Researchers who studied his skeleton, including work published by paleoanthropologist David Freyer in the early 2000s, found no evidence of trauma consistent with the kind of physical labor expected of every able-bodied group member. Instead, they found a burial. Romito II had been placed in the ground deliberately, next to an adult woman with signs of care in how the body was positioned. Someone in that community, roughly 10,000 years ago, decided a person who could never run down a deer was still worth burying with dignity. And, before that, worth feeding for 17 years. That's not the whole story either. In 2007, archaeologists working at a site called Man Bac in northern Vietnam uncovered a burial dated to roughly 4,000 years ago. The skeleton belonged to a young man, identified as Burial 9, whose bones told researchers something specific and severe: complete paralysis from the waist down, likely caused by a congenital condition called Klippel-Feil syndrome, present from birth or early childhood. His arm and shoulder bones were unusually thin and weak, consistent with someone who had never walked, never carried weight, never contributed physical labor in the way every other body in that farming settlement did. Bioarchaeologists Lorna Tilley and Mark Oxenham, who published a detailed analysis of the skeleton in 2014, calculated something remarkable. This man lived for years past the point where paralysis set in. Likely into his 20s, in a small agricultural community, keeping someone alive that long with no lower body function meant constant care. Someone had to clean him, someone had to reposition him regularly to prevent the kind of pressure sores that kill immobile patients. Even in modern hospitals without proper nursing, someone had to feed him every single day for years. Tilley coined a term for what the evidence at Manbach represented: the bioarchaeology of care. It wasn't sentiment, it was measurable. You could see it in the bones, the absence of pressure ulcers where there should have been catastrophic ones, the healed patterns that only made sense with sustained intervention. But here's where the pattern breaks from something comforting into something more complicated. Not every disabled or injured individual in the archaeological record was cared for. Not every group made the same choice. At a site in France called La Chapelle aux Saints, a Neanderthal skeleton discovered in 1908, now known as the Old Man, showed severe arthritis, a nearly toothless jaw, and evidence he'd lost most chewing function well before death. He likely needed food pre-processed, softened, possibly chewed for him by someone else. He was cared for extensively for what researchers estimate was his final years around age 40. That skeleton became famous. It shaped decades of thinking about Neanderthal compassion. What gets discussed far less is the silence in the rest of the record. For every Shanidar one, there are countless skeletons of individuals who show signs of severe injury or illness with no evidence of survival afterward, meaning they likely died at or near the point of injury. Anthropologists studying band-level societies, including work compiled by Gervan and Kaplan in a widely cited 2007 study on hunter-gatherer mortality across 12 different populations, found that in resource-scarce conditions, support for the incapacitated could vanish fast. A group facing its own starvation risk doesn't have the surplus calories to spend on someone who can't hunt. Others, the record suggests, were not. That means survival wasn't about the injury itself. It was about a decision made over and over by people who had every reason not to make it. Consider what that decision actually cost a Paleolithic band. Data compiled from studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer groups, including the Hadza of Tanzania and the Jiu Hwanzi of the Kalahari, show that a single adult forager typically brings in enough calories to support roughly 1.5 to 2 people beyond themselves. Add one dependent adult who can never hunt, and the entire group's margin for error shrinks. A bad season, a failed hunt, an early winter, any of it becomes more dangerous. Choosing to keep a disabled member alive wasn't a neutral act of kindness. It was a group actively accepting more risk to its own survival. They did it anyway. Not once, not in one isolated cave in Iraq, but across tens of thousands of years and thousands of kilometers. From Shanidar to Romito to Manbach to La Chapelle aux Saints. 4 sites, 4 continents worth of separation in time and geography, 4 instances of the same unlikely math, bodies that should have been left behind, kept alive instead. There's a site in Florida called Windover Pond that adds one more layer. Excavated in the 1980s, it held the remains of roughly 168 individuals from around 7,000 years ago, preserved in peat that kept even brain tissue intact. Among them was a boy, roughly 15 years old, with spina bifida, a spinal condition that in this form would have left him without use of his legs. He'd been buried with care, alongside the rest of his community, no different in treatment from anyone else in that peat bog cemetery. 15 years old, and every one of those years had required people around him to choose repeatedly that he was still one of them. What connects Iraq 45,000 years ago to Vietnam 4,000 years ago to Florida 7,000 years ago isn't proximity. It's a pattern showing up independently, again and again, in populations that never met each other, never shared ideas, never had contact of any kind. Something about small human groups kept arriving at the same answer. You inherited that pattern. Every system you live inside now. A hospital that treats a patient with no chance of contributing labor again. A family that cares for an aging parent. A friend who shows up when you're the one who can't carry your share. traces back through an unbroken line to a cave in the Zagros Mountains, where a group of people with almost nothing decided that a one-armed, half-blind man was still one of them. Not because it made survival easier, because for reasons the bones can't fully explain, it never occurred to them not to.